YouTube video. Gary, the mad one in America. I note on his channel that he's done a video to me about Federal Reserve reserves, Federal Reserves, Fed reserves. So, in the hope that it's going to be useful, I shall try and play his video and do the talking thing from my point of view. But I haven't done this for a while and I'm all a bit rusty on it, so we'll see how we go.
Alright, it should be semi-quick video, economic stuff, so you're warned.
Is that working?
Federal Reserve thing.
Federal Reserve, that's us. That's me.
Website had a post.
I do have posts.
Periodically, it comes to this subject where he saw something about like why don't the banks loan out the money in the reserve account?
Yeah, this is a thing. Why don't the banks loan out the money in the reserve accounts? So many people have been saying this for the last 6 years, something like that, maybe even 7 years now. And they ask this question. And it's a very interesting question because it brings up the fact that we have to dive in and find out why they can't lend out these reserves. There's so many people that, you remember right at the beginning, the Peter Schiff type people, but I mean intelligent people as well, were saying this is going to lead to hyperinflation. And it's very interesting to find out actually why it hasn't, because there is a reason why it hasn't.
And I don't know why. I don't know why I'm having difficulty persuading him that the answer is obvious and simple.
Gary is asking. I'm saying a bit what Gary's saying because I'm not totally happy that everything's picking up what Gary's saying, although I've got it on maximum volume. But it doesn't really matter. He's saying that he doesn't know why that he can't convince me that he's right. We'll see.
It's because they can't use the money.
It's because they can't use the money. They can't use the money.
Because the money wasn't put there through normal bank practice.
Because the money wasn't put there by normal bank practice. Normal. No, all right, it wasn't put there by normal bank practice. No, it wasn't.
So you have to understand, the reserve accounts were established basically to exchange money between banks.
The reserve accounts were established to exchange money between banks. Yep.
There's an efficient way to Bank A owes Bank B, the money is exchanged in the reserve accounts, and that facilitated an expedient way to transfer money between banks.
Yep.
And it had the secondary reserve accounts, which meant the banks were obligated to have a certain amount of collateral, so to speak.
And at the when it was initiated, it also meant that banks should have reserves, which they don't really have to have now. Yeah.
A certain amount of equity.
Not equity, Gary. No. Equity is a different thing. It's just words, but equity is a word that's used for something else. But I know what you mean. Something.
To hedge against a run on the bank or something like that. They had to have something in the bank, actually.
Kind of.
The intention of the reserve accounts is to create an institution that enforces the reserve minimums.
Yeah.
Now, essentially, they've gotten rid of the reserve minimums.
Kinda, yeah.
But the idea of doing the bank transfers is still a vital way of facilitating transfers between banks.
Yeah. The Fed zips the money between banks. I think the figures are something like, it's over 5 trillion a day. A day is between banks. that is facilitated by these reserves and the reserve facilities in the Federal Reserve Bank. Yeah, that's what it does, yes.
Is done by the Federal Reserve Bank.
Yes.
And, it's a way of monitoring things. And there's a lot of advantages to having it set up that way.
Yeah.
So traditionally, when the government wanted to, technically they never said, we're going to print some extra money.
The government technically says they never wanted to print any more money. They don't technically say that. No, they don't.
Cash and put it into circulation. So they never really let you know when they were doing that. But every now and then, they would put extra money in the reserve accounts.
Whoa. We've gone into fantasy land here. The government every now and then would put money in the bank's reserve accounts so extra cash could be put into the economy. No, it's just completely and utterly wrong. Just wrong. To the extent, if you can find anyone on the planet that also says that that's what happens, I'd be interested to know. Oh, it just doesn't happen. I mean, how could it possibly happen anyway? You've got Citibank, Bank of America, JP Morgan, Washington Mutual, whoever. What does the Treasury do? All right, we'll give you this much, and we'll give this much to Bank of America, and this much to JP Morgan, and all the pissy little banks that you've got in America, they get a little sprinkle each. And then that day, the banks open up and say, whoopee, the Treasury's given us a sprinkle. Think about it. It's not the way adults behave, is it? It's not the way things could possibly be done, is it really, if you think about it?
Okay, to increase the amount of currency in circulation. So, say in 1980, the amount of currency in circulation was 300 billion or something.
Could be.
It's now 1.2 trillion.
Could be.
And so that's essentially what inflation has been since 1980.
Could be.
This 400 or 500% number.
400 or 500% number. Between 1980, well, I'll say could be. This is one of these classic correlation does not mean causation things. Just because the amount of cash in circulation, and we've got to take in where, for the America it's very important for the dollar. I think even most dollars are actually out of the United States. They're not actually used in the United States. But just because the number from 1980 to now happens to equate to roughly what the inflation number is, that's a correlation, but there's no causation. It just happens to be right. If it's right, if you've looked, and that's what it is, it's right, but it doesn't imply any causation at all. And you can say, well, it's logical, but that's just kind of dogmatic thinking. Because you think it's right, and the correlation is right, then you imply causation. But that's not right.
So it's the same number, so you can kind of see a correlation between the amount of...
We can even kind of see a correlation. Yes, we can. If that's right, we can kind of see a correlation. But it kind of doesn't mean that there's any causation.
Cash, the Fed, has actually released in cash notes, and the inflation of the dollar. And it makes sense that the two would be closely related.
It doesn't make sense that the two should be closely related. It doesn't make sense at all. Cash, what you're saying is that the amount of cash out there should be closely correlated with the amount of inflation. No, it doesn't. Why should it? I've got two ways of looking at this. I might go into the other one later. But just think about it normally. How many cash transactions are done compared to the amount of transactions that are done? Let's say that AOL buys Time Warner. I'm just thinking that's a monster thing. That was, whatever it was, 20 billion. I can't remember. A big company buys another big company. No cash. Like the entire stock market, so all the stocks and shares bought and sold in Apple, no cash. The bond market, all the treasuries bought and sold in the United States, no cash. All the construction spending done to build bridges and skyscrapers, no cash. Housing, all houses that are built and sold, there might be, how many cash sales would there be? 1 in a million? Effectively, no cash. You buy a car, how many people buy cash? For an old banger, you buy cash. For any sort of new car or expensive car, you don't use cash. Effectively, no cash. White goods, how many white goods are even bought cash? Very rarely, it's either credit or credit card. That leaves us just with a bit of groceries. So there's no, the amount of cash that's out there, it's got no correlation to inflation, and there is absolutely no reason it should have, because nobody knows how much cash there is out there. You do, because you've got a particular bug up your arse about cash. But nobody else does. You could walk for 1,000 miles around your area and speak to everybody, and you won't find one other person that knows how much cash there is out there in circulation. So how's anybody meant to know? But more importantly, the amount of cash transactions done are so minimal, how can it have an effect on inflation? If I have time later, because this is obviously going to be a drag-on video, I might tell you about other things, mystic ideas, but we'll just leave it at that. Cash is almost irrelevant. So how can something almost irrelevant have a causation effect on something as magnificently important to everybody as inflation? It can't. There might be some weird correlations that you brought out, but that's just like some biblical scholar that's picking out little special things to prove their absolutely mad theory happens to be right. Correlation does not equate to causation, and especially not for cash. Just think about it. Just think again about what I've said about all the transactions that are done that have got nothing to do with cash at all, which is most all of the transactions that are done in the United States. So how can your silly little cash thing have so much effect on inflation? It can't.
Just like if there's 5 extra Picassos, Picassos get less valuable. And if there's 5 less...
Okay, the Picassos. See, this is like these libertarian types. They go back to this sort of dealing with coconuts and simplifying it. And this is a similar sort of effect. What you're saying is perfectly correct. In the art market, if there's an exhibition of Picassos and the building catches on fire and there's a lot less Picassos, the Picassos that went in that building being burnt become more valuable because there are less now Picassos in the world. The important thing here is, harping back to what I just said, the people of the art market know that there was a fire in a Picasso exhibition and there are now less Picassos. The people of the United States have got not a clue how much cash there is out there. And how could they have? You know, do they go, you know, counting their neighbours' purses and wallets? How could they possibly know? They don't know. And even if they did know, it wouldn't matter. But the fact is they don't know. But you're right, what you're saying about Picassos is perfectly correct. In the art market, where people know how many Picassos there are, but not in the cash market, where people haven't got a clue how much cash there is.
They get burned up in a fire, they become more valuable. And the same is true for the currency.
No, it's not.
So, what has to be understood is the money...
You see, can you not see how, just like a religious person you're being, you're getting one really weird thing out here, the Picassos, which is a very rare hypothetical thing, which is correct, and applying it to something huge in the big real world, and just saying, oh, well, they're the same, when they're not at all the same.
In the Federal Reserve accounts, didn't get there through normal bank transfers.
No, the reserves that are now in the bank's reserve accounts at the Fed, they did not get there through normal bank transfers. Not everything was normal, above board, and how it should be. They followed the correct accounting procedure, but it wasn't normal that that sort of accounting procedure was used.
Where Bank A owed Bank B, and the money was in the reserve accounts. And banks could put money in the reserve accounts technically. They could leave it in the reserve accounts because the government always took in all the bad money, and all the money that was...
Oh, this is the cash thing again.
Like dollar bills, resettled
Yeah.
every 2 years, I think.
Yeah,
3 years, something like that.
something like that.
So money gets degraded.
Yeah,
It goes to the Federal Reserve to get cleaned. The U.S. Treasury
Thrown
ultimately,
away.
anyways, it goes to the Federal Reserve first, and they put it back, the money that they owe to the banks, into the reserve accounts.
yeah,
And the banks can choose to pull it out as new cash.
yeah.
But that's how they put money, that's how they got cash into circulation, technically. Anyway,
Yeah, okay.
so
So?
the reserve accounts were usually the banker's money, is the point, primarily.
The reserve accounts were normally the banker's money. Yeah,
It was money that the banks, the Fed actually owed the banks. It was their money.
it's money that the Fed owed the banks. Talking about it and calling it money is dreadfully confusing, and it's a classic way of never understanding anything. And this is what I bang on about on the website. If you talk about money like this, you will run into troubles somewhere along the line. Anybody that talks about money like this will run into trouble, because money is not like this. Money is an accounting procedure, and if you're thinking about money as a thing, this is money, and they're here and there, and it gets transferred around as a one individual thing, you are going to run into trouble. And this is one of the reasons you're running into trouble here, because you're thinking about it as a one thing. Just picked up another one. Money is not, and money is a dreadful name for it, because people are so confused in their lives about what money is. They basically don't know. Money is an accounting procedure, and it always comes in twos. It's somebody's asset and somebody's liability, and then when it's transferred, it goes like this and then it goes like this, and if it goes to the Fed, to make it go vertical, it's the bank's, say, asset and the Fed's liability, like you're talking about now, that the banks have an account at the Fed. The Fed is liable to pay the banks the money that they have at the Fed. It is a liability for the Fed. It is a credit for the banks. If you don't think about things in twos, you will somewhere along the line, or often a long way, many places along the line, get into trouble. Getting into trouble.
The money in the Federal Reserve accounts now has nothing to do with any bank practices. It has entirely to do with the Fed asking the banks, to buy $5 trillion worth of bonds and junk and shit off the market so they can hide it.
Hang on, let's do this hide it later. It's not normal that the Fed asks the banks to buy off the market we'll call it five, if you want to call it 5 trillion, 5 trillion of various securities. To hide it, I don't know what this hide it is, but yes, this is what happened. The tricky, because they're kind of starting with a 1. The public has a security, a treasury or something, and sells it to a bank. The bank then well, I don't need to go through this again, do I? No, let's keep going, or we'll be here forever.
In a box, it's sort of locked, so they can pretend they don't have as much debt on the market as they do, because bond prices are so horribly low anyway.
Okay, I see where you're going. Bond prices are horribly low. Well, that's not right, is it? Bond price is low means the interest rate is high. Price is low, interest rate high. Price low, interest rate high. So that's not right, but people often get it the wrong way round. And in a way, yes, I think it was part of the Fed's stroke Treasury, stroke government altogether. I agree to put these in the same box. I think it was their fear that people might not buy treasuries and the interest rate might go up. It'd have to go up so they could sell them. Price come down. I think you've just got that the wrong way round, but people do. So I'm not saying that's wrong. In fact, I'm, and to hide, that's the hide, is it? To hide it off the market. Okay, I'll even say that's right. I don't think it's not quite right, but I think there was a fear by the government, Treasury and Fed that they would have trouble in the bond market with prices going down and interest rates going up. So they did take a lot off the market to hide it. Okay, yeah, go on.
They can't sell these damn things. They don't want to pay interest on them. So the way you avoid interest payments on bonds is you take bonds off the market.
Okay, that's the second thing, and I think that could be right as well. If the government doesn't want to pay the interest on the bonds, or even the principal on the bonds, it can get the Fed, via the banks, to take them onto the Fed's books, which is effectively the Treasury books, which is effectively the government books. So the transactions are just then up here, and they don't really pay anybody because they just pay themselves. Let's say that's right. So they did two things. They took them off the market, so the market had less of them in the Picasso sense. Now, here's another thing. In the Picasso sense for treasury bonds, that is not like cash. That is like Picassos, because experts know how many there are. It is like the art market. They know how many Picassos there are. The treasury market knows how many treasuries there are. So that does work. So less of them, price goes up, interest rate goes down. Correct. But not for cash, because nobody has a clue how much cash there is, right? Cash wrong, treasuries are like Picassos.
You also, by doing that, take things off the rich man purchase list. So it's like only rich people buy Rolls Royces and Lamborghinis and all this stuff, and only rich people would buy any of this crap, these bonds, and bankers, and hold them. So the only market you're affecting is the mega rich market.
Yeah, yeah.
And you're basically giving them, you're taking a whole bunch of Rolls Royces, you're decommissioning them off the market,
Yeah.
buying them off the market. So the ones that are left will sell at a higher price. So essentially,
Yep.
by buying all this $5 trillion worth of stuff only rich people buy, they've left it so the stock market had to go up because they basically took $5 trillion of stuff rich people would own, and the federal government now owns it.
Yeah, you didn't quite link it up, but yes, you're right. Because what happens is, you're a rich person, you own a treasury. It is then swapped for a deposit at the bank in this chain of things that then go up to the Fed and to the government. So you've got a deposit at the bank when you used to have a treasury. You don't want a deposit at the bank, that's why you had a treasury. So they don't want you to buy another treasury, so what else can you buy? You can buy a Picasso, or you can buy something in the stock market, maybe Apple shares or General Electric or something. So, yes.
Technically, the banks own it, because it was the banker's digits, and the Federal Reserve account is just the government basically securing the loan. So essentially, it's a secured loan. And
Hang on, secured loan. No, none of that's no, that's bollocks. Unless you can explain to me what you're talking about there. No, that's you've followed it right. That the Treasury went to the Fed. As this jumping of pairs went, the client that owned the Treasury in the first place has a deposit, an extra bit into their deposit account. The bank has reserves at the Fed, which is the equivalent of a deposit account for the client. It's a deposit account at the Fed. That's all. There's no loan being made at all. That's purchases every time. Swapping of asset to liability. No loan at all.
Banks can't spend the collateral for the loan. They can't loan the collateral for the loan. But even if they could, because there are no reserve requirements, they've essentially been told by the banks they can't, because that is now printed money.
No, this is again links to the first thing. What was the first fantasy you had? Oh, the sprinkling, the government sprinkling things into the bank's accounts, sprinkling cash reserves in there, which is just logically, you can just a logical person just goes, this is a mature world. That's not how things happen, and this is just another of those. What you're saying, I think, is that the government, Treasury, Fed are saying to the banks, in this series of accounting, you're going to get reserves, but don't spend them. Don't spend them. Don't spend them. That's not mature, is it, either? You don't get that. I mean, mature. When I say mature, I mean they're big kids, but they do deal in solid asset liability or contract signed by a lawyer on the bottom. You don't deal in don't spend it. That's just not likely, is it? It's not logically likely. No.
So as soon as any of that reserve money goes out without selling some of the stuff the government bought, the government doesn't sell what it bought with the money, and instead the banks take the money out of the reserve accounts. What will happen is that will be effectively new printed money.
It could be. It could be. The banks, I think, have the right to take their reserves as new printed money. Only they won't, because it's not financially a viable thing for them to do. Because in Europe, you'd think it was quite likely, because in Europe they are charged for their reserves, various amounts, but let's say 0.25%, which is, I think, what the ECB charges at the moment for reserves. In America, it's kind of the other way round, that the Fed gives them 0.25% to have their reserves there. So they get a little money at the Fed for having their reserves there. If they took it in cash, it would cost them a fortune in insurance and security guards. It's not a financially viable thing for them to do, so they won't do it. But, so I don't know where something stopped and where something started. Where we were was the reserves. In Europe, they have to pay for their reserves to be in the central bank. In America, they are paid. Banks are paid to have their reserves in. They can technically ask for them to be delivered in a Brinks truck But we are talking, billions for each bank. That would be an awful lot of cash. It would cost an awful lot of money to insure and to keep secure in the real world. It would be a real big cost for the banks, so they don't do it. And then if you think, well, the banks can then just spend it. Well, it'd only go to other banks. It doesn't matter. You can buy something off a bank, and obviously then you drive the cash down to some other bank, says you take the cash. Or you buy it off a private person, but they'll obviously then just put it in a bank. It's the same problem. That amount of cash would be in the bank vaults, which would cost them a fortune in security, and it wouldn't do them any good. And you think, well, okay, they say, being really tough, we will spend it. So we will spend it on whatever. But don't forget, the bank is a bank, and these reserves are the assets that a bank has for the liabilities that they have, which might be loans that the bank's taken, or more importantly to us, their deposits. Our deposits at banks are backed by assets. And one of the assets that the banks have are their reserves. If they go buying my golf clubs off me for cash, then the bank is starting to look exceptionally stupid, because its assets are looking shaky. So you can't just think, well, the banks can spend the money on prostitutes, because prostitutes aren't a very good asset for my deposits at the bank. Banks do have to operate in the real world and be responsible, or they get closed down. I know that's a joke, but basically, in this, to an extent, that's always true.
$5 trillion out, $6.2 trillion in circulation.
So you've got this idea that if the banks took their cash, their reserves as cash, that money would be in circulation, but it would not. Because for it to be in circulation, it has to be given to somebody. It has to be given to me, or a me-like person, to then go and spend, to then affect the inflation rate, for the way you look at it. You've got it to the banks. How are you going to get it out to the people? Why are the people going to want to have all that money? You've got it to the banks. The banks have got it in their vaults for some strange reason. All the banks in the country are stocked full of cash, costing them a fortune. So, why are you and your neighbours going to want to get all that cash out and start spending it? You're not. You had no desire to do it yesterday. So just because the banks have got all that cash at the bank, why are you going to do it today? You're not. So it can't actually affect inflation, because all it is stuck in a bank vault.
So you can obviously see that, whatever that would be, 4,000 or 5,000% inflation, that's not going to happen.
You see, by being stuck on a dogmatic idea, you get yourself to look stupid. By just extrapolating the idea, other ideas that you have based on the silly idea. And you're talking about 4,000 or 5,000% inflation. But it's just all hypothetical and stupid, because you won't get off the idea that the correlation of cash, if it happens to be, correlates with inflation, has got nothing to do with causation. You've got it stuck in your head that it's causation, when it isn't. And this dogmatic idea that you've got in your head just runs you into trouble, because you won't let it go. And now you're going, probably because it's right. And this is what happens when you think things are really right. You try and defend them, like the religious people do with bananas, by talking childish nonsense. It's much best to just let it go. If it's not right, let it go. And surely you can see it's just logically not right. The amount of cash out there has got nothing to do with inflation. Why should it?
So clearly there's been an agreement. The federal government has told the banks, look, you buy the crap with your banker digits, and effectively that's as far as it'll go. It won't be like real money in the economy, because the only part of the economy it'll affect is the stock market. And it affected no other part of the economy. Everybody saw that, right? QE didn't make...
Yeah, it's right. You've got that part right. So there's no need to slip in things that are wrong. There's no need to slip in, it's obvious that the government had an agreement with the banks. All you need to do is say the bits that are right. Because the government had a secret agreement with the banks is just obviously logically stupid. So there's no need for it. So if it doesn't sound right, it probably isn't right. Because you've got the rest of it right.
Jobs, it didn't fix anything. It made the richer richer. Yes. Okay. Stock market went way up, so the rich got filthy richer.
Yeah.
And that creates some trickle down. But it's as trickle down as you can get. I mean, this is Reaganomics all over again. Okay, make the rich preposterously richer, and some crumbs will fall on your head. You know, some of the cake of crumbs. That's all it was engineered for. It was to rescue the stock market, which was go ahead.
I think there was a bit of rescuing the stock market. There was fear that they wouldn't sell the bonds. There's a kind of knowledge that that you take things off the market and the price will go up and the interest rate will go down, and that'll be better for the government. And I think there was even because lots of economists at the Fed, I think even there was a hangover of some sort of variation on what you think about the quantity theory of money, which I think I'll stop here because we've done enough. The quantity theory of money, call it an Irving Fisher sort of idea, that the amount of money is directly related to the amount of inflation there is. Keynes, I think, was quite happy with this as well. Most economists are. Why? Because you can come up with an easy little equation. And economists love little easy equations, and they love even more really complicated equations. But what we had in the 70s and 80s, Milton Friedman going round with his quantity theory of money, telling governments what to do to get inflation down and all this sort of thing, is to drop the money supply. Now, thank you for still reading the website. You know that one of my favourite things is to bang on about money supply. What was Milton Friedman talking about when he was talking about the money supply? Loads of people talked about it, but to a greater extent he thought he was talking about the base money, the reserves in the Fed. Get the reserves down and inflation will come down. It's slightly complicated the way he thought it would work, but in the end it was so right that they decided to drop it because it was wrong. After Friedman and the 80s, what we've gone to the inflation targeting is by interest rates. They dropped the quantity theory of money and controlling inflation by the amount of monies, because nobody could really make sense of it, and they just went to interest rates. They dropped that idea, but I would imagine, yes, that there would still be older people in the Fed that still had the idea that there was some sort of quantity theory of money, and if they could get the reserve, buy in treasuries as well, the reserves of the bank would rise, and that would be good for inflation. That would cause inflation. I wouldn't be surprised if there was a good amount of people at the Fed which would throw that in as, it's not just one thing, is it? We'll do this because that'd be a good reason. That's a 25% good wedge why we should do it. I would think there are loads of people, because this is why I'm still making these videos, the posts and the on the website because people still believe it. Yeah, you've just shown that it's not true because they've got all these reserves, but there's no inflation. And when all these reserves were being put in there, let's say, people were going mad about it. It wasn't just Schiff. I mean, it was all over the place that this is going to cause inflation. And the Federal Reserve was putting things out saying that they thought it would help with inflation. I think it's just a hangover. They didn't really understand at that time how reserves worked. And it's taken them a long time, strangely, to work out how they do work. And work out the banks can't lend reserves and never could. And Friedman was basically always wrong. But give Friedman a bit of kudos because he was wrong, but there were complications. But yeah, I would think there was even a hangover from that. People thinking that if the bank's reserves were increased, then there would be more lending in the economy because the banks would lend those reserves out. Rather than have them in the Fed at 0.25, they'd prefer to lend it out at 5%. And that is what the banks don't do. Never have, never will. And I think there are lots of central bankers and most economists that still don't quite know that. And that's why I keep banging on about it on the website. Oh, go on, let's have some more.
They had nowhere to go.
I could do with a cup of tea, though.
Except down, and they couldn't allow it to go down because they don't have any. Nobody has any money, and they can't let the stock market go down because if the stock market goes down, then bonds have to be sold with interest. You're not going to be able to sell. If the stock market goes down, the rich get poor. That means there'll be nobody to buy the bonds. That means you have to increase the interest rates really, really high to get.
Increase the interest rate really, really high. The price goes really, really down. Yeah, that's what's happened. This time you're right.
People to buy them. You have to make them so attractive that people can't resist, borrowing the money to buy the bonds.
And it's a fear thing. I'll finish with this. So this is 16 minutes on this first one. I think why it stopped was probably because it stopped half an hour, wasn't it? Now I've got 14 minutes left on my second half hour. Okay, inflation. I think the quantity theory of money thing, although very attractive because it's attractive to libertarians because it's simple. Libertarians love simple things, and people in the south of America love simple things because they're very simple people. So they go for this. They think cash is wonderful and that sort of bollocks. Anyway. What we come to, oh Gary, this is very Gary, because what we come to here is the invisible hand. Now this is another Gary problem one, because hello Gary, you've never really liked the invisible hand because you've never really understood what it is. You kind of equate it with trickle down Reaganomics. But if you think about it, the way that you think that cash causes inflation, that would be the invisible hand. As in, the invisible hand is millions and millions of small, minute actions that cause a big action. And that's the invisible hand. And that is the way that you would imagine that your cash quantity is causing inflation to go up. Although I have no idea how. I'll tell you how I think inflation goes up. It's got nothing obviously to do. It's exactly the same like the cash thing that you're stuck on. The people who are going to cause the inflation, obviously they don't know how much cash is in circulation. They don't know what M1 is, let alone how much there is of it. They don't know what M2 is, let alone how much of it. They don't know what M3 is, MZM, and they don't know any of these things. We can accept that. The population of the United States of America have not got a clue what these things are or what their quantities are. Cash or any of the M's. They don't know what they are. They don't know what the quantities are. Okay? Does that sound reasonable? Obviously, there are a few experts that do, but they're a vanishingly small quantity of the population. So how are these quantities going to affect inflation? The idea would be via some sort of invisible hand, as in, if millions, hundreds of millions in America, certainly tens of millions, feel that they're fractionally richer, then they're going to pay fractionally more for a product. And there's then economists and idiots like you want to equate it to some sort of quantity of money because it's simple and you can write it on a bit of paper, or basically because it's simple. But it's a simple thing that gets to inflation, which is another simple thing, via fucking complication of such magnitude that it's utterly incomprehensible. That it's all these magnificently minor transactions, and so much of a multitude of them between here and here, that it can't work, basically. But this multitude, that's your invisible hand. I think inflation works basically simple human nature, and generally through the people in companies who work out how much wages to give people. It's obviously much simpler than this, and they use a basic heuristic, which is how much wage increase did we give them last year? That's one thing. And then, which might take up 90% of the decision, and then all other things like going to the Masons and listening to people like them of how much they've been given in wages, looking at facts and figures on the internet about how much wages have been given, will make up 10% of the decision, and then they'll come up with an idea. Normally, if wages have been going up and up and up like they did in the 70s, the increment of upness will be slightly more. They'll basically extrapolate and do what they did last time. Boom. At the moment, or let's even say over the last 25 years, wage increases have been trickling down, and the wage setter in the company will work out what they did last year, say 2%, and have a tendency to want to think, well, I'll go to 1.8. Where in the 70s, if it was 5%, they'd have a tendency to think, I better go to 6. I think it's that simple. That is basically how inflation is caused. They'll have in that 10%, the heuristic is what did we do last year, or in the last wage raise round, what did we do last year, and then just base a little thing off that. It might be the interest rate, it might be what the Fed says, but that had just come into 10% of it. That's, I think, much more likely how things happen than all coming through the invisible hand, which is this magnificent translation of millions of small transactions which make for closing the baker or whatever the end result might be. But can you see what your idea is? That a certain amount of cash created, however, doesn't matter, is going to create a certain amount of inflation. How? It's got to be via this invisible hand of people. They'll never know how much cash there is in circulation, because even the experts struggle to know. And even if they did, how could they make any sense of it? It's got to come through the invisible hand of millions of micro transactions. But so few transactions are made in cash that if you think that you've got 3 cents more than you did last year, on average, in your, wallet anyway, it can't make sense. Cash has got nothing to do with inflation, because it can't have. the quantity of theory of money. I really don't think it has much bearing on cash, on inflation either. And if it does, it comes to a slightly different idea that most money is deposits at a bank which are created by loans being made. Most loans being made for house purchases. If there's a housing boom, deposits go up. If you've got more, if there are generally, this is down here, if you think you're slightly richer because you're an estate agent or a real estate man, girl or whatever, you've got more money in your deposit account, you think you can spend more and you're more likely to go to the tanning salon or get your nails done than if you didn't have those deposits in the deposit account. It's got fuck all to do with cash, but it might have something to do with the general economy, that the general economy feels better when there are more loans being made, and therefore loans create deposits. If there are more deposits out there, people can see in their bank accounts that they've got more deposits and are more likely to go to make that extra purchase. Cash is irrelevant. Thank you very much for continuing to make videos and read the website. And I hope this time that you've understood that all you've got to do is forget this thing that your father probably taught you down south when you were a babe on his knee, that cash is important. Cash just isn't important. Get rid of that idea, and basically the rest of it is fine. You've got it right, and you can probably from there go on and do a lot more genius things, but you're not going to as long as you've got this idiot tent peg banged in that cash is important when it isn't. It'll just hold you back. So let it go, please. Thank you. Bye.